Hello and thanks for joining me. A couple of days ago, I finished my the last book that was on my 2017 must-read list. So I have finished my must-read list. My must-read goal for 2017 is complete. So I thought it'd be kind of nice to do a recap video, just where I review the books that were on the must-read list. So I actually did chats on each of these as I finished them. So I'll link the books with their chats in the details below. I will also link to the video from last year, where the announcement video where I announced the must-read list, because sometimes that gives an idea about why I chose a particular book. But yeah, I decided to do these. I'm going to divide these videos into two, divide them into nonfiction and fiction. This is going to be the fiction video, the nonfiction video, and then I'll do another video for the fiction soon to follow. But yeah, if you're not familiar with my must-read list, so what I do is I curate a list before the new year that is, this year it was 30 works that I wanted to read before, that I wanted to prioritize reading. And so what I do is I read off of that must-read priority list until it's finished, and then once that's done, then I'm free to read whatever I want to. I do, during the course of the structured reading, the must-read list, I do allow myself 5 interruption books. These are books that if I come across a book that I feel like I want to read that minute, drop everything and read, I can do that. This year there were 4 of those. So that, I think to me it works really well, because it gives me a part of my year is structured reading, where I'm reading things that I really want to get to, and then part of my year is free reading, ad-lib reading, which is going to be what I'm doing from now really until the end of November, and then in December again I plan to devote to rereading like I did last year, because I feel like it worked really well. So yeah, let's get to the list. This is going to be the nonfiction. This is going to be in the order that they were read, the nonfiction for must-reads for 2017, as well as any wild card interruption books that were nonfiction. So the first book, I kicked off my 2017 nonfiction reading with The Poetics of Space by Gaston Bachelard. This is a French philosopher. This book was written in the 1950s at some point. It's essays around rooms and homes and houses and space and corners. And it's just really beautiful. It's the poetics of that, how these interact with the human imagination, the human psyche in poetry and in literature. Wow, I was really not sure about this book when I chose it. It was kind of one of those books that I thought, well, maybe this is going to be a stretch for me, but it wound up to be a delightful read and very informative. The next book I read was on monsters, or the next nonfiction book I read was on Monsters, An Unnatural History of Our Worst Fears by Stephen T. Asma. This was a history of monsters, really the European view. Monsters, they change over time. From biological, deformities used to be considered monsters and called monsters. But the medieval era had different monsters than the 19th century and different than today, of course. So this was a lot of fun. Then the next nonfiction that I read was the first interruption book. This is Thoughts from the Dark Corner, Essays and Other Writings by J.P. Pereira. I came across this. This is a collection of essays. This was such a pleasant surprise. The author commented on one of my videos, and that's how I discovered it. But a little treasure this book was, so I enjoyed this very much. The next book was another interruption. So following, I was just finishing Thoughts from the Dark Corner, and I came across Conversations with the Future by Nikola Danilov. This is a collection of interviews with futurists and transhumanists along the lines of transhumanism, biological longevity, artificial intelligence, cryopreservation, these kind of futuristic technologies. So I dropped everything. This was 99-cent sale, and I thought, yep, I'm taking that. So I went ahead and read that. Then the next nonfiction that I read was called Stamped from the Beginning. The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America by Ibram X. Kendi. This won the National Book Award for Nonfiction last year. Wow, this was really informative, really accessible. But racism, it hasn't always been around in the form that we see it today. This racism against Africans, it has a history, and the history is knowable. And once you know it, it really exposes the ideas, for what they are, which are erroneous ideas. So that was a wonderful read. So glad that I put that on my list and got it read. Then the next book next nonfiction work, pull the cover up, Confucius and the World He Created by Michael Schumann. I wanted to read a book about Confucius because I didn't know a lot about him. This was a little bit part biography. Really, it was more focused on Confucius as far as the impact of Confucius on East Asian cultures to the present day. So that was very informative. It kind of made me want to learn more about Confucius, though. I do want to eventually read the Analects, so I got to get to that sooner or later. All right, so the next nonfiction that I read is called Give War and Peace a Chance, Tolstoyan Wisdom for Troubled Times by Andrew D. Kaufman. This is a book about War and Peace. So good, so good. It's been many years since I read War and Peace, but this was really dug deep into War and Peace, and there's a lot to War and Peace that I didn't realize. So that was a really good read. The next book that I read was my cousin and my sweet cousin and her husband sent me as a gift, Black Edge. They sent this to me because it deals a little bit with the pharmaceutical biotech industry, and that's the industry I work in. So it's very nice of them to send me this book. This is a true crime about Wall Street crime. I wasn't sure I was going to like this, but it wound up to be a page turner. Very much a kind of a thriller, how that case turned out. So I enjoyed that a lot. Then the next book is also the next nonfiction work that I read is also a physical book, After the Ice, A Global Human History, 20,000 to 5,000 BC by Stephen Mifkin. I had been wanting to read this for years. This was so good. It was so accessible. If you think that prehistory is not accessible, this book is very accessible. This is told in the form of a traveler, sort of a time traveler who goes all around the world, and he goes up into villages, these prehistoric villages, and describes them to us. So it's very informative. I love, prehistory. So that was my prehistory. Then the next work of nonfiction that I read is Vanished Kingdoms. This edition does not have a nice cover. It just has a title page, which annoys me. But Vanished Kingdoms, The History of Half-Forgotten Europe by Norman Davies. This was all about kingdoms that have disappeared from Europe. Very, very kind of cool. We don't think about this, that, France hasn't always been there, right? England's not always been there. Germany's not always been there. What was there before? So that was really an entertaining read as well. Then I had another interruption. Homo Deus. There's a story about why this was an interruption. It's in the video if you aren't interested. A Brief History of Tomorrow. This is a work of futurism. Wow, I love this. This is one of my favorite reads from the year, actually. It's by Yuval Noah Harari. I do plan on reading his other work called Homo Sapiens soon, hopefully this fall. Then I read my next work of nonfiction. It was A Most Dangerous Book, Tacitus's Germania, From the Roman Empire to the Third Reich by Christopher B. Krebs. Wow, this book from Rome, Tacitus's Germania, and how that has affected German culture, and affected German culture really in a positive way, really a sense of identity and things, up until the Nazi era, and then you can really tie it in from this book, the ideas of their culture that were transmitted from this book by Tacitus in ancient Rome, all the way to how they were then used by the Nazis in World War, the Nazi era. So that was very informative. Then the next work of nonfiction that I read was another history called SPQR, A History of Ancient Rome by Mary Beard. This was very entertaining. She's very witty. She's a professor of classics at Cambridge, I believe it is. I think it's in my chat video, so check that out if you're interested. Really, this covers the whole history of Rome. Well, not the whole history, up until about the year 200 and something. From its mythological foundations, but it's very accessible to the general public. I think it was very readable to me, so I enjoyed it very much. Then the next work of nonfiction I have here is, oops, sorry, I clicked on the wrong one first, so let me get to the right one. Here we are, at the Existentialist Cafe, Freedom, Being, and Apricot Cocktails by Sarah Bakewell. This I just breezed through. This was another really readable about existentialism and the development of existentialism. Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Camus, a lot of figures from mid-20th century Paris and France and Germany. So very informative, and I enjoyed that immensely. Then the next work of nonfiction that I read was called, this one was kind of challenging for me, The Jazz of Physics, The Secret Link Between Music and the Structure of the Universe by Stefan Alexander. Yeah, Coltrane, Einstein, The Music of the Spheres. It was a good read. I had to kind of skip over the mathematical formulas, which the author writes in a real memoir style, so it was very readable. Just the math, he actually says, he's just putting the formulas in there, because that's where they belong. But if you don't understand those, it's okay, and it's true. You can get his ideas and grasp his ideas without actually getting the math. Thank goodness, because I would never probably get the math. Then the next work of nonfiction that I read, oops. You can pull up the cover. Here we are. It's a biography. I wanted to read a biography because I don't read a lot of biographies. Pyotr Tchaikovsky. I have came away with this with a whole new appreciation for the music of Tchaikovsky. So really fairly short biography. The Critical Lives series. I love this series. It's full of interesting people. I would like to read more in this series, I think. Then the next work of nonfiction that I read was a memoir, another form that I don't read a lot of, so I wanted to get a memoir read this year, and I chose Stars Between the Sun and Moon, One Woman's Life in North Korea, An Escape to Freedom by Lucia Zhang. Wow, she had a tough time in North Korea. Very grim in places, but really shines a light on the experience of people in North Korea. And I didn't know a lot about that, so I found it very informative. Then finally, but next I read Musonius Rufus's Lectures and Sayings. This is a Stoic philosopher. This is my work of Stoicism that I wanted to get in for this year. Translated by Cynthia King, Musonius Rufus was one of the big four Roman philosophers. This was full of practical everyday advice about how to live a good life, and it's the kind of thing that I love to take away from Stoicism. So this was a good read, fairly short but good. And then finally, the last work of nonfiction that I read for 2017 off of my must-read list was Weep, Shudder, Die, A Guide to Loving Opera by Robert Levine. This was a really fun general introduction to opera, the main works in the opera languages, and the details, some synopsis of the main operas, as well as details about the music. Just a lot of fun, a very funny writer, and I enjoyed that a lot. So that is my must-read nonfiction. I will do a video soon about wrap with a recap of my must-read fiction, and then I will probably still get a couple of more nonfiction works read yet this year in the 2 months that I'm doing free reading. I have a couple in mind to read. So I will close with that. Until next time, take care. Bye.